Hello, my dear friends. They used to stuff crocodile dung into their bodies and then take it out to reuse. They applied hot resin to their private parts until they burned and became sore. They washed themselves in the Nile water filled with human excrement and animal carcasses. This was not an isolated incident, but the daily hygiene routine of the ancient Egyptian prostitutes. No baths, no soap, no right to refuse, just the pungent smell of sweat, blood, and perfume. No one taught them how to live cleanly, only how to survive. Tonight, we step into the brothel where perfume hides rot, and hygiene is just a rumour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever thought that ancient prostitutes in Egypt had no understanding of contraception, you would be only partly right. They did not have pills or devices, but they had rituals. They had recipes, passed from one generation to the next. Some were based on plants, some were based on superstition, and one of the most disturbing involved crocodile dung. Not as a warning, not as a symbol, but as an actual object placed inside the body. It was common, even expected. To protect themselves from unwanted pregnancies, many women inserted a thick mixture of dung, honey, and herbs directly into the vagina before seeing a client. The preparation was simple. Dung was collected near riverbanks, often while still fresh. It was left to dry for part of the day in the sun, then ground into a coarse powder. Honey was added to bind the particles and mask the smell. Some women added bits of acacia or date paste to help it hold shape. The result was rolled into a soft cone, about the size of a fig. It was wrapped in thin cloth or inserted directly. The texture was sticky, the scent was pungent, but that was the method. It had been done before, it would be done again. The belief was rooted in the symbolic power of crocodiles. Sobek, the crocodile god, represented fertility and strength. Using something from his body was thought to balance the female cycle. Whether it worked or not did not matter. The belief held more weight than the results. There was no testing, no questioning, just habit and repetition. A woman who refuses might be seen as careless or disrespectful. Even clients would notice if the preparation had not been done. She did not make a new mixture each time. That would take too long. Instead, many prostitutes prepared several plugs at once. They kept them in clay containers or linen pouches, lined with dried leaves to absorb moisture. After use, the plug was not discarded. It was removed, wiped gently with a cloth, then stored again for future use. Some women would reapply honey to the surface to freshen the scent. Others would sprinkle dried herbs. The core remained the same, used but reused. There was no washing between uses, no boiling, no drying beyond air and heat. The same object, used again and again, absorbed more than just odour. It became a sponge for bacteria. Infections were common. So were ulcers and discharge. But none of it stopped the practice. The body adjusted. The pain became normal. Women were taught to ignore the discomfort. They were not taught to understand it. It is hard to imagine this level of exposure being seen as routine. But for these women, it was not shocking. It was expected. Many started the practice young, some as early as their first few clients. There was no privacy. Older prostitutes watched, instructed, and corrected. They showed how deep to push, how to angle the hand, and how long to leave it in. Everything had been done before. Nothing was considered too personal. Compared to modern methods of contraception, the contrast is almost unbelievable. Today, we rely on sterile packaging, scientific approval, and regular replacement. They relied on sun-dried feces and faith, not because they preferred it, but because there was no other choice. Access to herbs like silphium or papyrus paste was limited to wealthier women. Prostitutes used what was available, what grew nearby, what could be harvested without cost. Some believed the dung created a barrier. Others believed it burned slightly and killed the seed. No one really knew. What they knew was that without it, they had a higher chance of pregnancy, and a pregnant prostitute was not desirable. She would lose clients. She might lose her place in the brothel. In the worst cases, she might be cast out altogether. So the risk was not about health, it was about survival. What disturbs me most is not the substance itself, but the quiet certainty with which it was applied. There was no hesitation. No moment of doubt. The practice had become so integrated into daily life that it was not questioned. It was not considered extreme. That makes it harder to dismiss. These were not isolated cases. This was the norm. The dung plugs were not the only step in preparation, but they were one of the first. Before makeup, before scented oils, before jewellery, this came first. A woman could paint her eyes with coal and stain her lips with crushed berries, but if she skipped the internal ritual, she was considered incomplete, dirty in the wrong way, vulnerable to both shame and consequence. So she complied. On some days, she would run out, the jar would be empty, the next mixture is not ready. In those moments, women turned to friends. They borrowed. They shared. One would remove her used plug and hand it, cloth-wrapped, to another. The exchange was quiet, quick, understood. There was no embarrassment, no revulsion. That only came centuries later. There were variations. Some added resin. Others used tree bark mixed in. The goal was to make it thicker, less likely to slide out, but thicker also meant more friction, more pain. Bleeding was common. Sores became part of life, but appearance mattered more than sensation. A woman who bled was still expected to work. The act of insertion became part of the job, not foreplay, not preparation. A task, done alone, sometimes in a corner, sometimes behind a thin cloth. There was no time to rest, no time to clean, only time to be ready for the next man. The plug had to be in place. No exceptions, no excuses. Men rarely asked. Some noticed the scent, some did not, but no one questioned it. The smell of dung, honey, and herbs was part of the air in certain quarters of the city. You could identify a brothel by it. The walls absorbed it. The curtains held it. The woman wore it without trying. It followed them even after they left. At night, some women removed the plug. Others left it in, believing it worked better overnight. They slept with it. They bled with it. They walked with it, until it hardened or cracked or fell apart. Then they made a new one, or borrowed again. It was not a clean life, but it was a system, built from desperation, maintained by belief, passed on by those who had no better option. It served a function. It gave the illusion of protection. It gave women something to control in a world where everything else was chosen for them. But the plug was only the first layer. After that came something even more basic. Hands. And how little effort was made to keep them clean. In the next part, we will look at what happened after the client left, and how hygiene often stopped at the wrist. After removing the plug and setting it aside for the next time, there was rarely a pause. The routine continued. Her hair, like the rest of her body, was not left alone. It had to be maintained, treated, and prepared for the next client. Not with soap, not with oils, but with something far less expected. In some quarters of the city, the women used urine to wash their hair. Not just any urine, male urine, preferably aged, collected in jars, stored for days, and used once the scent turned sharp and sour. That was the signal that it was ready. It was believed that aged urine had cleansing powers. The ammonia, though they didn't know it by name, seemed to dissolve grease and dirt. When applied to the scalp, it made the hair softer, shinier, and easier to comb. The smell was strong, but the results were visible. In a profession where appearance mattered more than comfort, that was all that counted. Some women went further. They claimed the scent had an effect on men, that it awakened something, that it made the woman smell more natural, more real. That belief kept the practice alive. The process began in the morning. A small bowl of urine, usually saved from the night before, was poured over the head while standing in a corner of the courtyard or under the sun. She leaned forward, letting it soak through the roots, and she rubbed it in with her fingers, slowly, like massaging oil. There was no rinsing, no water followed, just the liquid soaking in, followed by the sun. She sat quietly afterward, letting the heat do the rest. The smell intensified in the sunlight, but that was part of the method. It is difficult to picture someone pouring fermented urine over their head and calling it beauty care, but that was the daily truth for many prostitutes in ancient Egypt. They did not flinch, they did not complain, they focused on the goal, a scalp that felt less oily, hair that clung to itself in smooth waves. This was not a spa ritual, it was maintenance, necessary, predictable, effective, at least in appearance. Compared to today's routines of scented shampoos, conditioners, and hair masks, the contrast is startling. Modern hair care promises both fragrance and cleanliness. Their method promised only results. The cost was odour. A woman's hair might look neat, even elegant, but up close, the sour edge of ammonia was always present. Some masked it with crushed mint or lavender. Others did not bother. Clients learned not to mention it. If they did, they risked losing her attention. There was another layer to the ritual. Not all urine was equal. The strongest, they believed, came from young men who had not eaten fish the day before. Fish made it too thin, too weak. A thick, yellowed sample was considered ideal. Some women had regular suppliers, stable boys, temple guards, even household slaves. They traded bread or dried figs in exchange for jars. The exchange was quiet, mutually beneficial. No one joked about it. The jars were clay, wide-mouthed, easy to pour. After a few days, the contents separated slightly, with a film at the top. That film was skimmed off. What remained was stirred, not shaken. Each woman had her preference. Some added crushed herbs to reduce the sting. Others believed that pure urine, left untouched, worked best. They said it tingled on the scalp, like proof that it was doing something. There was no fixed schedule. Some were washed once every 3 days. Others did it daily, especially if business was slow and they had time to prepare. Rainy days were bad for the ritual. Without the sun, the hair stayed wet too long, and the smell lingered more stubbornly. On those days, women often stayed indoors, heads wrapped in linen, waiting for the next chance to dry. I find it hard to decide what's more unsettling, the smell itself or the way it was completely normalized. The women did not just tolerate it. They believed in it. They trusted it. If a new girl refused, she was scolded, corrected, or even mocked. You want to look clean or smell clean, they were asked. The two were not the same. Hair mattered in ways that went beyond appearance. A greasy head meant laziness. A tangled head meant carelessness. A soft, clean-looking braid, even if it smelled like waste, signalled discipline. It meant she was ready. Some women shaped their hair into rolls or coils after washing, tying it up with dyed strings. Others wore it loose, especially in the evening, when candles were low and shadows softened the lines of the face. But no matter the style, the base was the same. A scalp soaked in male urine and dried in the sun. The hair was not combed immediately. It had to dry first. Combing too soon could pull strands out. After drying, it was brushed gently with wooden or ivory combs. Some women shared combs. Others had their own. But like the urine, the comb was rarely cleaned. It carried the scent from day to day, from one wash to the next. Over time, the wood absorbed it. Holding the comb was like holding a memory. Strong, faintly sour, familiar. Urine was also used to bleach lice eggs. They believed it softened the outer shell, making it easier to crush between fingernails. There was a rhythm to it. Wet, dry, pick, repeat. Every few days, always in the same spot by the window or near the brazier. No one commented. It was part of life, like folding linens, like lighting the oil lamp. This was not the only body part touched by urine. In some cases, women applied a diluted version to their feet, believing it prevented cracking. In others, it was used to soften scabs or help with rashes. But the hair was always first, always most important. The head, they said, was what a man looked at before anything else. The practice was not written down. It was not in scrolls or temple walls. It lived in repetition, one woman to another, a quiet inheritance of habits. Not all of them made sense, but they were shared and trusted and passed on. By nightfall, the hair would have absorbed most of the liquid. The smell remained, but the shine was visible. That was enough. It did not have to be pleasant. It only had to look good in dim light. But while the head was treated with care, the hands were another story. After hours of touching, holding, and guiding, they were barely touched at all. In the next part, we will look at what those hands carried and why cleaning them was rarely part of the routine. While the hands were rarely washed, the rest of the body received more attention, not in ways we might expect, and certainly not in ways that would be considered safe, but attention nonetheless. One of the most painful routines focused on the outer parts of the genitals. This was not for cleansing, it was for control, a method believed to make the body tighter, more desirable, more valuable. The material used was tree resin, heated until soft, then applied directly to the skin, still warm, sometimes close to burning. It was done not once, but regularly, and it left marks. The resin came from local trees, thick, amber-coloured. It was scraped in chunks and collected into clay pots. Once gathered, it was melted over flame, stirred until it reached a sticky, almost liquid consistency. Then, while still hot, it was poured into smaller bowls and left to cool slightly. Not too much. The heat had to remain. That was the point. The sensation had to be strong. If it did not sting, they believed it would not work. The application was done in private. No assistance, no medical tools, just fingers. The resin was scooped and spread along the outer folds of the vulva, carefully avoiding the inside. The heat caused immediate discomfort, a burning sensation followed by tightness. Some women cried. Others gritted their teeth and pressed forward. The more it hurt, the more effective they thought it was. That logic was not questioned. It had been passed down too many times. The goal was to create a subtle contraction of the skin, to make it feel newer, less used, less open. Some thought it shrank the flesh. Others believed it simply made things smoother. The outcome varied. Sometimes the skin became red and dry. Other times, it blistered. But they continued. A woman who skipped the treatment might be mocked or ignored by clients. There was no space for softness or hesitation. It is painful to imagine that these women felt they had to burn themselves in order to seem more worthy of work. But for many, that was the reality. They did not do it because they wanted to. They did it because the market demanded it. The illusion of youth mattered more than comfort, more than pain, more than health. Compared to modern beauty treatments, this was not just extreme, it was dangerous. Today, people seek rejuvenation through licensed clinics, anesthetic creams, and careful timing. These women had fire and faith. That was all. No doctor, no ointment, no recovery period. If the resin scabbed, it was left to peel off naturally. If it bled, she dabbed it with a cloth and kept working. There was no day off. Some women mixed the resin with other substances. Beeswax can be used to reduce the burning, crushed lotus to mask the smell, but others used it purely, the strongest form, because that was what some clients preferred. They claimed they could feel the difference. They said it made the woman feel new. Those words carried weight, enough to push women into doing it again and again. The results were rarely clean. Many developed open sores. Some areas turned purple, then black. Numbness became common. The nerves beneath the skin, once irritated too often, stopped reacting. There were women who lost sensation altogether. Still, they kept applying, because without it, they said, the body felt loose, and loose meant failure. What stays with me is how normal these injuries were to them. A wound was not a reason to stop. It was a sign the resin had worked. They touched the area with salt water when it oozed. They covered it with a soft cloth during the day, but they did not rest. They did not avoid contact. That would mean losing clients, losing income. So they learned to hide the pain. The schedule varied. Some applied resin once a week. Others did it before important visits. Days when wealthier clients were expected. Nights when temple officials might arrive. These were not regular customers. They were seen as opportunities, and the resin was a form of preparation, like makeup, like perfume, like jewellery. It belonged to the same category, except it burned. There were quiet warnings among women. If the skin started to split, they said, skip the resin, wait until it heals. But even that advice was not always followed. Younger women, eager to impress, often ignored the signs. They ended up with permanent scars as thick, raised lines that never faded. Still, they were expected to continue working. No one offered rest. No one asked how they felt. There were worse outcomes. Infections that spread beyond the skin. Swelling made movement difficult. Fever. Pus. But unless it reached the point of collapse, most women did not stop. A body in pain was still usable as long as it could be presented, as long as it could pretend. Clients rarely knew, or pretended not to. Some noticed the raw skin, the smell of burnt flesh beneath the oils. They did not speak of it. They moved past it. What mattered was the feeling, and the feeling was all the woman could offer. The resin became a symbol of effort, of obedience, of endurance. It marked the body in ways no one admitted. Even after a woman left the trade, if she ever did, the effects remained. The skin did not forget. Neither did the nerves, even when the touch was gone. Some women whispered that the resin made them sick, that it changed their body in ways they could not explain. Bleeding that came late, pain that never stopped. But there were no physicians to help them, no midwives who specialize in this kind of injury. So they relied on herbs, prayers, and silence. In some homes, jars of resin were stored next to perfumes, on the same shelf, one for the nose, one for the flesh. Both are used to attract, both used to hide. The line between beauty and harm was thin, sometimes invisible. There was no rule about when to stop. No age when it was no longer needed. As long as clients kept coming, the ritual continued, the fire returned, the pain repeated, the scar deepened. But even this was not the most private act in their daily preparation. Some rituals went further, inside the body, beyond the surface, beyond the burn. In the next part, we will look at the substances they inserted for ritual protection, and how their bodies became vessels for both fear and faith. After the burning sensation faded and the skin was left to recover, some women turned to rituals that were less about appearance and more about protection. Not physical protection in the modern sense, but spiritual cleansing. They believed that the body, especially the lower part, could carry not just illness but guilt, bad luck, sin, and to remove it, they used blood, not their own, not menstrual, but the blood of animals, collected fresh, stored briefly, then applied to the most intimate areas of the body. The belief was not tied to hygiene in the way we understand it. It was not about killing bacteria or preventing disease. It was about restoring spiritual balance. Prostitutes in ancient Egypt were often treated as necessary but unclean. They lived on the edge of society, both wanted and shunned. Some accepted that role. Others tried to purify it. The ritual of blood was one of their tools. The most common sources were sheep and goats. Animals are sacrificed in other ceremonies. The blood was gathered in shallow bowls before it touched the ground. It had to be warm, alive. That was the rule. Once cooled, it lost its power. The blood was either poured onto a linen strip or scooped and smeared by hand. It was applied in a circle around the genitals, or sometimes dabbed on the inner thighs. In some versions, the cloth was folded and inserted briefly, not for hours, just long enough for contact. It is strange to imagine women using blood as a form of cleansing, but for them, it was not strange. It was sacred. It was believed that the blood absorbed negative energy, that it pulled shame from the body and carried it away. After the application, the woman would sit still. No speaking, no touching, just waiting, until the blood dried. It was wiped away with scented leaves or rinsed with warm water. Compared to modern ideas of purification, this practice seems not just outdated, but unsafe. Today, we define clean with soap, disinfectant, and sterile water. They defined it with the pulse of a slaughtered animal, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they saw cleanliness as more than physical. They saw it as moral, emotional. The body had to be reset. The smell was immediate, metallic, thick. Some women added resin or crushed mint to dull the edge. Others used nothing. The stronger the smell, the more potent the ritual was believed to be. Clients rarely witnessed it. The act was private, done before sunrise or after sunset, in silence, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. There were risks. The blood, if left too long, began to ferment. It turned sour, sticky. If stored in a warm place, it could attract flies. If applied too late, it caused irritation. It was not always fresh. In some brothels, the same bowl was used more than once, shared between women, passed without comment. They believed that shared rituals created shared protection. That which worked for one would work for all. Infections followed, some mild. Others are more severe. Rashes, burning, sores. But they were considered part of the process. If the skin stung, it meant the ritual had found something, pulled it out. A woman might wince, but she would continue. Stopping would mean leaving herself exposed, spiritually open, vulnerable. What unsettles me most is how willingly they accepted these risks in exchange for a feeling of being clean. Not visibly, not medically, but internally. As if the guilt itself had weight, and the blood could wash it away. They were not forced. They chose this because few other options gave them the sense of control they needed. The blood was not always applied directly. In some cases, it was soaked into a cloth and folded into a pouch. The pouch was tied to the waist and worn under the dress. The warmth of the body kept it moist. It stayed there for hours, sometimes until evening. The scent followed the woman all day. Some claimed it kept away evil spirits. Others said it calmed the womb. No one knew for sure, but they believed. On religious days, the ritual became more elaborate. Candles were lit. Chants were whispered. The blood came from animals offered at temples, considered more powerful, more holy. Women knelt on mats, pressed the cloth against their thighs, waited for the prayers to finish, then stood, washed, and returned to their work. There was no celebration, just a return to routine. The use of blood was not limited to prostitutes. Some women in other professions used similar rituals. Dancers, temple attendants, midwives. But for prostitutes, the ritual had an edge, a sense of desperation, of hope buried under repetition. Because their work touched so many bodies, they believed they collected the troubles of others. The blood was their way of letting go. Not all participated. Younger girls often resisted at first. The smell, the texture, the unease. But over time, they were brought in, encouraged, coached, told that without cleansing, things would go wrong, money would stop, illness would come. It was not a choice. It was part of the job. Some women marked each ritual in secret, scratched a line into the wall, kept count of how many times they had done it. Some reached dozens, others more. The numbers meant nothing, but counting gave structure, a way to measure time in a life that rarely changed. The leftovers were handled with care. The used clothes were burned, or buried, never thrown away. It was dangerous, they believed, to discard something that had absorbed impurity. That impurity could return, could find someone else, so they made sure it disappeared. The act of destruction became part of the cleansing itself. In a world with no medical knowledge of germs, they still feared contamination, not from what they could see, but from what they felt. A heaviness, a shadow. They used blood to fight it, because blood, to them, was life, and anything alive could take something dead away. But for all its ritual meaning, blood could not protect against everything, especially not what lingered on their own skin. After the ritual, many women went straight back to work. No washing, no drying, just wiping the area and dressing. The residue remained. The scent followed. The body, both sacred and unclean, continued its cycle. And if the blood could not stop the illness, they turned to other tools, some that were sharper, more painful, more permanent. In the next part, we will examine the tools they used to shave, scrape, and injure themselves in the name of hygiene. Even after performing rituals with blood or burning resin, few of these women took the time to clean their hands, not because they did not want to, but because there was rarely any water, and certainly no soap. The concept of hand hygiene did not exist in the form we know it today. Their hands touched many bodies, many substances, and yet remained largely untouched themselves. They were not washed between clients. They were not rinsed before handling their own food. Most of the time, they were simply wiped. Wiping meant different things. Sometimes it was a scrap of cloth, often the edge of a skirt. In some places, it was a handful of sand, rubbed between the palms, let fall to the ground. The motion gave the illusion of cleaning. The grit removed visible fluid, but it did nothing for what remained underneath. Nothing for the bacteria or blood or semen that clung to the skin and under the nails. Between one client and the next, there was rarely time to pause. The same hands that held, guided, and received were reused, without thought, without hesitation. It was the rhythm of survival. The room did not have a basin. The door did not open to a courtyard with flowing water. There was no servant waiting with warm cloths. The woman stood, adjusted her dress, and waited for the next knock. It is almost impossible today to imagine someone using the same unwashed hands for one body after another, but that was the only option these women had. They were not taught to clean. They were not given the tools to do so. What mattered was that they were ready, that they could open the door, lift the curtain, or nod to the next man without delay. Compared to modern hygiene standards, the gap is so wide it feels fictional. In a world where hand sanitizer is in every pocket, they had nothing but dust and habit. Some women knew the risks. They noticed the way their hands began to crack, the small sores between fingers, the rough patches that itched at night. But they did not connect it to cleanliness. They thought it came from work, from effort, from age. The kinds of residue left on the hands were not minor. Semen was common, so was vaginal discharge, blood, sweat, oil, and herbs used for treatment or stimulation. Sometimes crushed petals, sometimes old resin. All of it layered onto the same palms, built up over hours, pressed into the creases of the skin, and yet those hands would still be used to eat, to fix hair, to apply kohl to the eyes. There was no designated cloth for hand drying, no clean towel hanging near the bed. Clothes were reused, sometimes shared. A woman might wipe her hands, fold the cloth, and tuck it into her sash. Use it again hours later. There were no rules, only instincts, and those instincts were shaped by what they had seen, not what they understood. Some women tried alternatives. Ash mixed with water, crushed herbs with rough leaves, but nothing removed the deeper traces. After a long night, the fingers still smelled, the palms felt sticky, the nails turned darker, and if there was no light, no mirror, those details remained unnoticed. What I find most disturbing is not just the physical residue, but the emotional numbness that came with it. The hands became tools, not extensions of the self. They were not treated as sensitive, important, or worthy of care. They were extensions of labour, used until they hurt, then used more. The consequences showed slowly: infections in the nail bed, swollen knuckles, fungal growth between fingers. But these were not treated. They lived with, bandaged if they bled, bitten if they burned. One hand was favoured when the other became too sore. There was no healing, only adjusting. Clients noticed sometimes. They looked at the hands and winced, saw the raw edges, the red fingertips, but they did not speak. It was part of the price. They did not come for beauty. They came for access, and the hands gave it. In some places, women painted their nails to cover the stains, not with polish, but with crushed ochre or herbs. The red hid the black, the green distracted from the yellow. It was not decoration. It was a disguise, an attempt to make the hands seem cleaner than they were. There were whispers, too, about cursed hands, that if a woman touched too many men without cleansing, her hands would begin to take on their burdens, that the weight of their guilt would settle into her skin, that her fingers would start to shake, her palms would sweat at night. Some believed it, others laughed, but still, they rubbed their hands with mint leaves after a bad client, just in case. No one tracked how many times a woman touched another without cleaning her hands. No one counted how many different bodies left their marks on her skin. There was no tally, just layers, a silent history, pressed into flesh, from client to client, from food to face, the same hands, again and again. In the absence of cleansing, some women developed rituals, not with water but with motion, rubbing hands together quickly, clapping twice, brushing them against the doorframe, as if movement could undo what had been done, as if speed could erase touch. These habits offered no protection, but they gave comfort. When rest finally came, the hands were not soaked or scrubbed. They were placed beside the head, folded under the cheek, left as they were, cracked, stained, heavy. In the morning the cycle began again, the same cloth, the same skirt hem, the same handful of sand, the same acceptance. But the hands were only part of the picture. What they touched also stayed with them, especially the surfaces shared between one woman and the next. In the next part, we will look at the bedding they slept on and worked on, and why the sheets were rarely ever changed. The hands carried what they touched, but they were not the only things that went unchanged. In the rooms where work was done, another surface bore the same burden. The bedding, the place where women lay, where clients moved, where bodies pressed into each other. The cloth spread beneath them was not washed after every visitor. Often, it was not washed at all until the end of a long day. Sometimes not even then. There were not enough linens. That was the simplest reason. A brothel might have only a few sheets per room. In smaller spaces, there might be just one, made of linen or coarse cotton, thin from use, stained from history. Each woman had a corner. Each shift rotated through the same bed. One man left, the next arrived. No one lifted the cloth. No one flipped the mattress. It was always the same. The stains remained visible. Dark patches from sweat. Small blooms of red where bleeding had occurred. Dried traces of semen, lotion, oils, and powders. These marks told a story that no one wanted to hear. They were signs of use, not eroticism, not luxury, just reminders. What one man left behind, the next one touched, sometimes with his own back, sometimes with his hands or face. It is hard to imagine lying down on a surface still warm from the previous body, but that was the daily rhythm in many brothels. There was no pause, no reset. The bed did not belong to the woman. It belonged to the room, and the room never rested. As long as there was a man waiting, the sheets stayed down. Compared to modern expectations of hygiene, where hotel staff change linens daily and hospitals dispose of used bedding, the gap is wide and deeply unsettling. These women worked in places where fluid soaked into fabric and dried without question. The smell became part of the air. The cloth absorbed it. So did the mattress. If there was a mattress, in some cases, it was just straw, piled thin beneath the linen, too thin to absorb everything. The women grew used to it, not numb, just resigned. They adjusted their bodies to avoid the worst stains. They folded a small cloth to place under their hips, a layer between skin and soaked cotton. But the cloth was rarely clean either. It was used because it was available, not because it was sanitary. Clients noticed. Some wrinkled their noses, some asked questions, others said nothing and lay down anyway. They had come for the body, not the bedding. The cloth beneath them was someone else's problem. The woman was expected to make them forget what came before. Her hands, her voice, her body, all offered distraction. At times, women tried to clean the sheets themselves, with water from a basin, with soap root or salt. But water was limited, and drying took time. In hot weather, the sheets dried stiff. In cold, they stayed damp, and so the effort was often abandoned. One cloth is used for days. Then it was swapped when another became available. The linens were not marked. No one kept track of whose sheet was whose. If one became too stained, it was turned over. If both sides were marked, it was folded in half. If that failed, another cloth was placed on top, layered until the mess disappeared from sight. But it was never gone. What troubles me most is how these layers of filth were accepted as part of the job. There was no expectation of clean sheets, only an understanding that work had to go on. The body could not wait for laundry. The client would not return later, so the woman lay down again, in the same spot, with the same cloth, over and over. The stains were not always old. Some were still damp, still warm, and the woman knew exactly what they were. She had watched the man before, heard his voice, seen the cloth move. Now it was her turn. She did not flinch. There was no space for revulsion, only repetition. Some tried to protect themselves. They lined the bed with herbs, crushed leaves to mask the smell, placed petals around the edges to create the illusion of freshness. But it was surface only. The cloth beneath held more than scent. It held what could not be washed away by flowers. There were consequences, skin rashes, open sores, infections from lingering contact, not just for the women, but for the men as well, though they rarely admitted it. The bed brought more than pleasure. It passed the disease, it passed the discomfort, it passed reminders. In winter, the stains grew cold. The beds felt wet even when dry. In summer, the smell intensified. Sticky patches clung to skin. The fabric pulled at the thighs and backs. A woman who moved too fast risked tearing skin already raw from earlier clients. Sometimes, the stains became symbolic. A woman might see her blood from the night before and remember the pain. Another might notice a patch that looked familiar and realize the client was back again. The sheets became a journal no one wanted to write in. Each mark, a line. Each night, a page. Women rotated through rooms. They worked in shifts. One woman's bed became another's. Her stains became another's risk. There was no ownership, no privacy, just function and fatigue. When sheets were washed, it was done in public basins, scrubbed by hand, beaten with stones, dried in the sun. But even then, not all stains came out. The cloth thinned, threads loosened, holes opened, yet the sheet returned to the bed, again and again, until it tore. Then it was sewn, or replaced by something worse. New linens were rare, a gift from a generous client, a purchase by the madam, a stolen piece from a rich home. They were folded with pride, smelled, admired. Then they were placed on the same bed and quickly lost their shine. For the women who lay there, the bed was not a place of rest. It was a tool, a surface, a requirement. It was never clean, but it was necessary. Still, not every stain came from others. Some came from within. From the clothes they placed inside themselves, not for beauty, not for comfort, but to stop things as they could not stop on their own. In the next part, we will look at how women tried to manage their monthly bleeding with scraps of fabric and practices that caused more harm than relief. The cloths they used to manage bleeding were hidden beneath layers of fabric. But what could not be hidden was the smell. In places where water was scarce, and time even more so, full bathing was rare. A prostitute in ancient Egypt might go days without washing her body, sometimes longer, instead of bathing. She covered herself in layers of scent, thick, clinging oils made from crushed plants and resins. These did not remove the odour of sweat, discharge, or blood. They only added to it. The result was a smell that hovered around the body all day. Sweet, pungent, overpowering. The oils were made in small quantities, blended by hand, applied with fingers. Some women used lotus oil. Others preferred cinnamon bark or frankincense. These were strong, dark substances, sticky to the touch. They left marks on linen, on skin, on hair, but they were seen as essential. A woman without scent was considered careless, unfinished. And a body that did not smell like something other than itself was unwelcome. The application took time. The oil was warmed slightly over the flame, then rubbed onto the armpits, behind the knees, around the neck, across the lower belly, and often between the thighs. Some women added it directly to the folds of the vulva, believing it masked the deepest smells. It did not. It only mixed with them. It is easy to romanticize ancient perfumes, but these were not subtle accents. They were shields, thick, blunt layers meant to cover what could not be washed away. The scent stayed on the body through work, through sleep, through heat. It seeped into bedding, into clothing, into hair. It could be smelled before the woman entered the room, and long after she left. Compared to modern hygiene, where washing precedes perfume and fragrance as a final touch, these women used scent as a substitute. They did not have access to clean water or time for rinsing. Their bodies were always in motion. Their oils were their only bath. Some believed that the strong scent kept away bad spirits. Others believed it pleased the gods, but most simply knew that without it, they would lose clients. The oil did not prevent the smell, it transformed it. Sweat mixed with floral notes. Blood added iron to the sweetness. The result was thick and sour, a smell that clung to the nostrils. Some men found it intoxicating. Others tolerated it. Very few commented. Women prepared their oils in advance, stored them in small clay jars, applied them with cloths, or with the tips of their fingers. They did not wipe away dirt first. There was no time. The oil went directly over the skin, whatever condition it was in. Some women reapplied between clients, others only once a day. The strength of the scent often made reapplication unnecessary. The base for these perfumes was often animal fat or thick plant oils. They turned rancid if left too long in the heat. Some jars smelled worse than the bodies they were meant to disguise, but they were used anyway, replaced only when they caused visible skin irritation, boils, rashes, peeling. Even then, the woman might continue. A raw patch on the skin did not mean a day off. It meant she had to use less oil in that area. There were favourites among scents. Blue lotus was considered calming. Myrrh was expensive, but long-lasting. Cinnamon stung slightly when fresh. which some believed meant it was working. The choice depended on cost, availability, and superstition, not personal taste. Women rarely used what they liked. They used what kept men returning. The oils were not confined to the body. They were added to hair, to clothing, even to food, in small homes near brothels. The air was thick with overlapping smells. One woman's oil would mix with another's. Clients would leave reeking of the same mixture. So would the money they paid with. Coins held a trace of sweetness. A reminder of where they had been. What unsettles me most is how completely scent became their skin. They were not known by their names. They were known by how they smelled, and that smell was not always theirs. It was a mix of the brothel, the room, the clients, the day. No two applications were the same, but all left a trace. Bathing happened, but rarely once a week, if water was available. Less during drought. The oil stayed on the skin for days. Dust stuck to them. Sweat mixed in. The body became layered, not clean, just masked. The idea of washing before oil was distant, unachievable, a luxury. Some women used sand to scrub the top layer before applying oil again. It scratched the skin, left red marks, but it removed the worst build-up. That was enough. There was no soap, only friction and time. Clients expected the scent. Without it, they asked questions, thought something was wrong. A woman without oil was seen as neglected, sick, not worth paying for. So even when sick, even when bleeding, the oil went on, always, without fail. In certain temples, incense was burned around the body to enhance the scent. The woman stood naked or half-dressed. The smoke curled around her. The oil warmed again. It sank deeper into pores. She was told she was ready, that now no man would resist. But the body under the oil had not changed, only its smell. These rituals were repeated until they became instinct. Oil before dress, oil after touch, oil before bed. Even if the cloth she lay on was stained, even if her hands were cracked, even if she had not rinsed herself in days, the oil was the constant. But over time, the skin absorbed more than fragrance. It also absorbed infection. The oil sealed it in, trapped it. And when wounds appeared, there were few options. Still, oil was seen as a gift, a tool, a layer of beauty over discomfort. But sometimes, even the strongest scent could not hide the presence of sickness, especially when that sickness began to show in places no oil could reach. In the next part, we will look at how women tried to hide infections and wounds, and how fragrance became a mask for something far more dangerous. No matter how thick the oil or how sweet the scent, it could not stop what the body produced. Fluids came with the work: lubrication, blood, semen, discharge, sweat. These needed to be managed, especially during long hours with many clients. The most common method involved simple materials placed inside the body. Small folded cloths or natural sponges. Nothing special, nothing clean, just what was available, what could be inserted, removed, and reused. Linen was the most common, cut into strips, folded tightly, sometimes wrapped around a small twig or rolled into a ball. Sponges were less common but still used. Natural sea sponges, imported and sold at markets, were trimmed to size, softened in water, then placed inside the vagina to absorb moisture. These inserts served many purposes. They were meant to protect clothing, to reduce the mess, to control the flow, but they were rarely fresh. Most women did not use a new piece each time. They used what they had. 1 or 2 items of clothing for the entire day, washed briefly between clients, rinse in a basin or wipe with a damp rag, left to dry in a corner, then used again and again, until the fabric tore or the sponge crumbled. It is difficult to imagine using the same cloth inside your body for days, but that was standard practice. There was no access to disposable products, no sterile packaging. A woman who had more than one clean insert was considered lucky. Most had one. Some shared. Compared to today's standards of menstrual hygiene and internal care, where everything is individually wrapped, sanitized, and replaced, their methods seem almost unbearable. But for them, this was not a matter of neglect. It was a matter of necessity. They made do with what they could reach, what they could afford, what could be hidden beneath their clothes and removed without anyone noticing. The clothes were not always washed thoroughly. Water was precious. Soap was rare. A quick rinse was the most many women could manage. Some added herbs to the rinse water, some mint, basil, acacia bark. These gave the cloth a fresher scent, but they did not remove bacteria. They did not eliminate yeast. After a long day, the insert smelled, a mix of body fluids, oils, sweat, and heat. When removed, they sometimes stuck to the skin. Dried discharge clung to the fibres. Removal was slow, sometimes painful. A small tear in the inner wall was common, but no one spoke about it. It was part of the job. The clothes were dried on windowsills or hung inside rooms. There was no privacy, no shame. Women recognised each other's fabrics, knew whose was whose. But on busy nights, even those boundaries blurred. One woman short on time might borrow another's. She asked, or she did not. Either way, the cloth was used again. Sponges were worse. They absorbed more, but they held more as well. A sponge used once could trap fluids deep within its pores. Without proper cleaning, it became a nest for infection, mould, bacteria, fungi, but sponges were expensive. Replacing them was not simple, so they were rinsed, squeezed, dried and used again, until they fell apart. What unsettles me most is how these tools, so intimate and so vital, were treated as if they were external, as if they were no more important than a hair tie or a sandal. Their place was inside the body, yet they were left on dusty ledges, carried in cloth bags, touched by unwashed hands. Infections followed. Yeast, bacterial vaginosis, itching, burning, discoloration. Women learned to ignore the symptoms. They chewed bitter leaves to ease the discomfort. They sat over steam baths filled with herbs. They did not stop using the clothes. They could not. The inserts were not used only during work. Many women wore them all day. Even while walking through the market, even while sleeping, they felt safer that way, less likely to leak, less likely to be stained. But constant wear meant constant exposure. The skin never had time to breathe. In some cases, the clothes were made from recycled material, torn robes, old headdresses, strips from worn bedding. There was no standard, no instruction. Each woman did what she had seen others do. The process passed from body to body, a silent tradition of makeshift protection. Some tried to sterilize their clothes with heat, place them near fires, wrap them in warm stones. But too much heat hardened the fibres, made them rough, caused small abrasions. This led to more infection. There was no perfect method, only repetition, only habit. The smell of used cloths mixed with the oils on the skin. It rose when the woman sat, when she knelt, when she opened her legs. Clients noticed. Some turned their heads. Others said nothing. They had their own reasons for being there. Smell was just one part of the transaction. On bad days, when water was scarce or the basin was dirty, the clothes were not rinsed at all, just folded and tucked away, stored in a pouch at the hip or behind a curtain, used again that night. By then, they were stiff, crusted, but still used. No one counted how many times a cloth had been used. No one tracked when it had last been washed. The body adjusted, or it did not, but the practice remained. Sometimes, when a woman died, her belongings were collected, her clothes, her jewellery, her combs, and often, among them, her clothes, still folded, still stained, still stored. a reminder of what the body endured and what it learned to live with. But even these inserts were not enough to protect from all risks. The body still bled, still cracked, still tore. When that happened, there were other methods, not to soothe, but to seal, to hold things together by force. In the next part, we will explore how women used heated substances and sharp tools to close, dry, or control their skin when nothing else would stop the pain. When cloths failed to protect the skin or control the flow, the body had to be dealt with more directly. One area received particular attention, the hair around the genitals. In a culture that valued cleanliness but had few resources, removing pubic hair became both a ritual and a risk. The women did not have razors. There were no polished blades or sharp scissors designed for the task. What they had were stones, rough, flat, worn smooth on one side, or broken bits of metal, a splintered needle, a cracked hairpin, anything with an edge that could scrape skin and pull hair. The method was simple. Hold the skin tight, pull the hair, drag the edge. The results were not smooth. The process did not glide. It scratched. It tore. Tiny cuts opened. Some bled. Some healed quickly. Others did not. Still, the practice continued. A woman with trimmed hair was seen as cleaner, younger, more appealing. Even if the hair would return in days, the momentary impression was enough. The scraping happened in private corners, on low stools, in courtyards after sunset, in silence. Women crouched, leaned forward, pulled their skin tight, pressed the stone or metal with short strokes. There was no mirror, only touch. When the scraping hurt too much, they paused, rubbed the area with a cloth, then began again. It is painful to picture someone using a broken needle or a sharpened rock to remove hair from such a sensitive area. But for them, this was not optional. It was expected. They had seen other women do it, heard client comment, learned to associate bare skin with desirability. Compared to modern grooming, where disposable razors, electric trimmers, and gentle waxes are common, their methods were crude and harsh, but they were all they had, and even those tools were shared. In the brothels, there might be one stone for 3 women, one bent needle passed from hand to hand, rinse in cold water, dried on a sleeve, then used again. The risks were clear. Redness. Burning. Razor bumps without razors. Cuts became infected. Insects were drawn to the open wounds. Yet many continued. They rubbed salt on the area after shaving, hoping it would disinfect. It stung. They did it anyway. The pain was a reminder that they had done the work. Not all removed all hair. Some trimmed. Others focused on the edges. The line that might be seen when lifting a skirt. Total removal was rare, but the effort was always there. A sign of care, of attention, of discipline. When one woman finished, another waited. She asked to borrow the tool, or she simply took it. There was no ownership. The tool belonged to the room, to the rhythm, to the cycle. If it broke, someone found a new edge, a broken pottery shard, a fragment of bronze. What disturbs me most is how casually these dangerous tools were handled, as if the skin would always recover, as if the cuts and blood were just part of maintenance. They were. There was no nurse to call, no ointment to apply, only time. And silence. The women rarely discussed the wounds. If they itched, they scratched. If they swelled, they sat differently. If they wept, they waited. The cycle repeated weekly, sometimes more. The same edge, the same hand, the same result. Occasionally, a woman grew tired of it, let the hair grow, covered it with oil, hid it beneath the cloth. But when a client noticed, she was warned, told to clean up, told she was falling behind. So she returned to the stone, the metal, the scrape. Some tried to soften the area first, applied warm cloths, pressed crushed herbs into the skin. but these tricks only dulled the first few strokes. The pain returned quickly and stayed. They told themselves it was worth it. The hair did not stop growing, the wounds did not stop forming, but the cycle continued. One woman stopped shaving only when the infection became too deep. Her legs swelled. She could not walk without pain. The others avoided her, afraid of what she carried. But no one offered help. No one knew how. In some places, women made a ritual of shaving, burned incense nearby, chanted softly, believed the act would remove not just hair, but shame. That bare skin meant a fresh start, that the pain cleansed the past. These beliefs gave them strength, or distraction. The used tools were kept in small pouches, wrapped in cloth, hidden under bedding, a flat stone, a bent pin, a twisted nail. The same items scraped different bodies. No one tracked whose skin had touched it last. They trusted that it would work, that it would hurt, that it would be enough. When the tools became too dull, they were sharpened, rubbed against other stones, tested on arms. When they became too small, they were discarded, buried, or thrown into the river, but always replaced. The scraping never stopped as long as there was hair, as long as there were clients. Some women bore scars. Thin lines crossed the skin near their thighs, raised bumps that never faded. A history written in marks, not tattoos, not decoration, just memories of effort, of expectation, of pain. The scraping was not just for clients, it was for themselves. A reminder that they were still trying, still keeping up, still part of the cycle. Even if the pain grew, even if the tools failed, they continued. But the effort to maintain the outer body did not stop at hair. They also worried about what might be seen on the skin. Rashes, boils, open sores. These had to be hidden, covered, sealed, especially when they appeared in places no cloth could hide. In the next part, we will explore how women tried to conceal visible signs of infection and how those efforts often made things worse. The scars left by scraping were often hidden beneath fabric, but the fabric itself told another story. Beneath the outer dress, beneath the sash and the oils, many women wore a single layer of linen closest to the body. It served as underwear, though it did not resemble what we know today. A narrow strip of woven cloth, tied around the hips, pulled between the legs, a barrier between skin and garment, a necessary layer, but not a clean one. The cloth was rarely changed, not because the women preferred it that way, but because they had no choice. Many owned only one or two. These pieces were worn for days, sometimes an entire week when the work was busy, when water was limited, when the night was long. The same piece stayed in place, soaked and dried, drenched and reused, always against the same skin. The fabric absorbed everything: sweat, discharge, menstrual blood, residue from oils and herbs, traces of semen. The longer it stayed, the stronger the smell became. And it was not a smell that faded. It deepened, became part of the cloth, embedded in the threads. The scent did not just linger, it clung, even after rinsing. It is hard to imagine wearing the same undergarment through days of physical contact, heat, and bleeding. But for these women, it was the most basic reality. There were no drawers filled with replacements, no piles of clean linens. There was what she wore, and what she tried to keep wearing. Compared to modern standards, where underwear is changed daily and washed thoroughly, the contrast is overwhelming. But in ancient brothels, washing was a luxury. Rotation was a dream. Cleanliness was a story they told each other to feel better about what they had to do. In truth, they wore what lasted, and they made it last as long as possible. The cloth was not washed each night. If time allowed, it was removed and rinsed, dipped in whatever water was left in the basin, hung near the wall. But most nights, there was no such time. The woman fell asleep in the same clothes, woke with it still damp, still heavy, still scented. She adjusted it, smoothed it, and started again. The area underneath suffered. Constant moisture caused irritation, rashes, sores. Friction from the cloth added to the damage. When the fabric began to stiffen from old stains, it scraped the skin, left small cuts. The body learned to endure it just like it endured the heat, the pain, the eyes of strangers. Some women tried to perfume the fabric, rubbed it with crushed mint, dried rose petals, oil mixed with wine. But the result was always the same. A sweet note on top of something far more sour. The mask could not last. The scent of use returned by midday. Clients noticed. A few turned their heads. Some held their breath. Most said nothing. They had paid for access, not comfort. They came for touch, not scent. And the woman knew that. She didn't apologize. She did not explain. She adjusted her skirt and continued. What stays with me is how these women were forced to accept discomfort as ordinary, and how that acceptance hardened them to suffering. The cloth was not just a garment. It was a reminder of work, of bodies, of things that could not be washed away. The fabric aged quickly. After a few weeks, it began to fray. The edges curled, the centre thinned. Some women stitched the tiers. Others layered the cloth, added patches, folded it differently each time to reduce wear. Still, the fabric gave out, and when it did, it was replaced with whatever could be found. A piece of curtain, a strip from an old robe, anything that could hold. In colder months, the cloth never dried fully. It stayed damp beneath layers of clothing, itched constantly, but removing it meant exposure, so it stayed wrapped, pressed, warmed by the body, by the fire, by necessity. When infections came, they were blamed on other things. A bad client, a cursed night, rarely on the cloth itself. Even though the fabric carried every trace of the day, every drop, every smell, it was not seen as dangerous, just familiar. Some women had a backup, a second cloth, but even then, the second was not always clean, just slightly less used. It waited in a bag, in a jar, beneath the mattress. It was rotated when the first became unbearable. Then the cycle began again. In brothels with shared clothing, the underclothes were sometimes passed from one woman to another. If someone had none, she borrowed, folded it differently, pretended it was hers. There was no judgment, only understanding. Everyone had been without at some point. Everyone had borrowed, or taken. The scent of the cloth lingered in the room, on the bedding, in the air. It was not a passing odour. It stayed in the corners, mixed with oils and incense, became the signature of the space. Visitors recognised it, carried it with them, on their clothes, on their fingers, on their coins. Women grew used to it, to the feeling, to the smell, to the way the cloth stuck when they sat, shifted when they walked. It became part of their movement, part of their memory, not because they loved it, but because they had no other choice. And even this was not the end of what they wore. On certain days, they added more, not to protect, but to suppress, to hold back the body in ways that left scars deeper than any cloth ever could. In the next part, we will explore how women used makeshift materials to block bleeding during their cycle, and how those efforts often caused more damage than relief. When the clothes became too heavy, when the itching would not stop, when the body swelled or stung without a clear reason, many women turned to what they believed was the most natural form of cleansing, the Nile. It was not just a river, it was life. It was a ritual. It was a myth. Its waters were thought to carry power, to cleanse not only the skin but the spirit. So when the pain grew unbearable, they walked toward its banks, and they washed. They did not wash in private pools or shallow basins. They crouched near the edge, where the mud was thick and the reeds grew tall. Some stepped into the water waist deep. Others stayed near the shallows, pouring water into clay bowls and bringing it back to their rooms. The water was used without filtering. Without boiling, it was sacred. It did not need to be touched by fire, only by faith. They believed that the river could take away their burdens, that the water flowing endlessly could carry off the shame of the night before, that it could cool the heat of infection, that it could soften the skin, calm the itch, quiet the ache. And for a moment, it did. The sensation of wetness, of movement, of being submerged, it offered something that cloth and oil never could. It is heartbreaking to think that women turn to dirty water in search of healing, believing it to be pure. But when belief is all you have, it becomes stronger than fact. They had no access to medicine, no understanding of microbes. They judged water by its taste, its tough, its a legend, not by what it carried. Compared to modern hygiene, where water is filtered, treated, and tested, their use of the Nile seems dangerous beyond reason. But danger was not their first concern. Relief was. Ritual was. Something greater than them was supposed to live in that water, and that made it safe. Or so they were told. The reality was different.